Good morning. This is Horizon's Middle East and Africa, our top stories this Friday morning. Investors await the U.S. jobs report set to shape the Fed's rate outlook. Trader bets for cuts have escalated this week amid softer U.S. data. Israel ramps up its war rhetoric against Hezbollah in Lebanon amid increasing cross-border attacks. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu accepts an invitation to address a joint meeting of U.S. Congress. Plus, do not miss our half-hour special covering the top news across the African continent. We look into the aftermath of South Africa's election, as well as the currency challenges some nations are facing. That and more with Jennifer Zabazaja at 8:30 a.m. Dubai time. But for now, it's just gone 8 a.m. across the Emirates. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai. Let's get you caught up on some of the top market news over the last 24 hours. And we did see somewhat of a muted session for Wall Street yesterday. S&P ending close to all-time highs, so not quite attempting to break through yesterday, up about 6 basis points and leaning towards another positive open today. Attention, of course, turning to that non-farm payroll figure coming up in a couple of hours' time. The expectation is that you will see a drop in that headline figure. It's been averaging around 250K for most of this year, but the market expectation is for a 180,000 number when it does come out, which would be another sign that the U.S. employment market has started to cool. 10-year yields also in focus this week, down about 30 basis points over the course of the week. It's sitting at 4.3%. That's just around that 200-day moving average, although slightly below it. Seems to be providing some support. Euro also in focus. Remember, yesterday we had the ECB meeting. Well, they did go for that 25 basis points cut. That was priced into the market, but it seemed to be a hawkish cut. So still a lot of questions about what happens next and ruling out the possibility of committing to any particular forward path of further rate cuts, something we'll talk about more on the show. And then Brent, you can see, has finally got a bit of a bid. We're back to $80. So we've really done a full round trip since that OPEC Plus meeting came out on Sunday. We are still lower to the tune of about 1% for the week, but we are seeing some bids emerge back into the oil complex again. As OPEC Plus, yesterday, ABS, His Royal Highness, the Saudi energy minister, was in St. Petersburg talking about the voluntary cuts and the fact that it is not set in stone. They will be subject to market conditions. All right, one other terminal chart that we're watching out for today. I thought it was quite interesting to take a look at the NVIDIA effect and how it's impacting stocks around the world. Here you can see, no surprise, but it's having a major impact on Taiwanese stocks. That, of course, is on back of TSMC. NVIDIA is TSMC's second largest customer. Their largest customer is Apple. NVIDIA is their second. So no surprise, as NVIDIA keeps climbing and climbing, the stock How is now through $3 trillion market cap. It's also fueling a rise in some of those Taiwanese stocks as well. So speaking of Asia, Avril Hong is in our Singapore studio standing by. And of course, it's not just about Taiwan, but we have a big RBI meeting to look forward to as well, Avril.
Absolutely. We are going to be watching out very closely from what we hear from the Reserve Bank of India. In the meantime, Asia investors are sitting on the sidelines in wait-and-watch mode ahead of the U.S. jobs report. We are actually seeing South Korea markets back today, so they are playing catch-up to yesterday's tech-driven rally that was fueled by NVIDIA. But see how the rest of the region, it looks pretty negative. Declines really seen on the CSI 300 and the Hang Seng, while the Nikkei is clocking some losses, about 0.2% down. Let's flip the board because we did get some data out of China, and it showed the trade numbers, the export front. It actually picked up more than expected. The imports was the big miss, and this kind of fuels the optimism that we can see the manufacturing sector kind of lead the way in terms of China's growth recovery. But the domestic demand, that's the side that's really not playing ball, not holding up its side of the bargain in a way. And I think this kind of reinforces the need for more policy support, especially when you see following the rescue package in the month of May, there's not been much follow through beyond that. And that's really being reflected in the markets of late. That's what we're seeing in China, but flip the board, we're also keeping a close watch on the FX space. Actually, not much moves in the renminbi versus the dollar. As I say, it's about the US jobs report, but we are keeping a really close watch on the Japanese yen. Today, we did see the BOJ keep the bond purchase amount unchanged. I think defying some expectations, we could see it reducing it in a way. Remember, the BOJ meets next week, and there are some in the markets that think it could start talking about reduction of bond purchases. The rupee is the other one that we're really keeping a really close eye on. It's faced a lot of volatility this week. The RBI decision is due later this hour. It's not expected to change on rates, but it could send some dovish signals because after the election results this week, there were some concerns about India and the commitment to growth-oriented policies. Right. So maybe we might see some comments in that direction, Jumana.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the overview. We'll be watching out for that meeting in about 25 minutes' time. Now, turning to another central bank, the ECB has delivered a rate cut as promised while also raising inflation forecasts. Bloomberg has learned officials are all but excluding a second rate cut in July, and some also question if such a move would be wise in September. That leaves investors guessing on the ECB's next steps while still betting on another rates reduction this year.
We are not pre-committing to a particular rate path. We will continue to follow a data-dependent and meeting-by-meeting approach to determining the appropriate level and duration of restriction.
Meanwhile, traders are watching a key U.S. jobs report due later today that is likely to guide the Fed's policy outlook. Now, let's bring in Sophie Huynh, a senior cross-asset strategist at BNP Paribas Asset Management. Good morning to you, Sophie. Well, for anyone out there who was hoping to get more signals on what the ECB were going to do next, they're probably a bit disappointed.
We're actually quite positive, and we think this hawkish cut is good, as in we think it's going to be quite positive for euro-dollar and for European equities because they're cutting. The easing cycle has started. They're still inflation vigilant, but at the same time, you see that some of the cyclical indicators are troughing. So in the short term, this easing cycle, cyclical indicators troughing is going to be good for European assets because it kind of removes this tail risk from a potential lag effect of this years of monetary policy tightening. So we think it's a good thing.
What do you make of the upgraded inflation forecast? It seems a bit incongruous to start cutting interest rates, but at the same time upgrade some of your inflation forecasts.
At the same time, they have also upgraded the growth forecast. So I think everything is in line, but keep in mind that we're still going towards their target. So it's not as if their target was out of their way. So we think overall, like everything makes sense. They are responding to the recent surprises. But from a market perspective, I think it's quite positive where European equities could definitely benefit from this on top of like the stories about a potential restocking cycle.
Yeah, what do you think that means for the euro? We saw a bit of a bid for the currency emerge right after the decision came out, some volatility in the subsequent hours, but ultimately we ended up marginally stronger on the day. Do you think that strength continues in the euro?
Yeah, where I think euro-dollar could definitely hit 110. I think what's been dragging on euro-dollar as of late is markets have been very complacent about US exceptionalism. But you see that if you look at the economic surprise indicator in the US, it's falling off a cliff. Quite concerned about European growth when the PMIs have been recovering. So euro-dollar have been picking up in line with monetary policy news, like interest rate differential. But if you start to discount further US exceptionalism and this recoupling story to take hold, we think that euro-dollar could go much higher.
What does that translate to equities? How does it translate to equities? I see in your notes you talk about Europe potentially outperforming the US. Is that a growth story or is that an equity story?
It's an equity story. So I think what could be supportive for European equities is the restocking cycle. But I think the fact that if you look at the US equity market, the AI frenzy has been insulating the mega cap tech from this higher for longer rhetoric that has been dominating in the US for 2 months now. But if you look under the bonnets, this higher for longer rhetoric is having an impact on the average US stock. European equities and especially small caps are less leveraged. They should benefit more from this troughing cyclical indicators. So from a relative perspective, if you think it's going to be some kind of risk on in the coming month, European equities should definitely fare much better, especially small caps.
So let me just follow on from that. Do you not expect leadership out of the Magnificent Seven, or in this case, it's really Magnificent Three, to continue in the coming months, given that you expect that we've passed the cyclical trough in data?
I think like the Max 7, it's been much more forced allocation, as in no one really understands how the AI adoption pace is going to pan out in the next couple of years. And given the recent surprises, especially on the NVIDIA side, you're basically forced to have at least a neutral stance. I think the expected returns in the coming month, if we have a risk on, which is our view, is going to come from laggards. So the rest of the US equity market, like the 497 now, should benefit. But I think the laggards is going to be much more European equities and Chinese equities from that standpoint, on top of like, and in Asia, we like Korean equities as well.
Yeah. A quick question for you about some of the price action we've had in some of those higher yielding currencies over the course of the last week. Obviously, post-election results, we've been following the South African rand very closely, the Indian rupee, Mexican peso, bit of volatility across those currency markets. Do you expect that to continue? And do you expect this volatility shakeout to scare away some investors from that carry trade?
Yeah, I think what's quite ironic is the currencies where you had elections are also the high carry currencies. And actually, since the start of the year, if you decompose the carry trade, the performance of the carry trade has been all coming from the short leg and not the long leg. So kind of like reflecting the ongoing political uncertainty. In the coming month, I think that the fact that there's going to be a risk on tone, the search for carry could potentially continue and protect these currencies. But I don't think that's not where the biggest expected return is going to come from. I much prefer the high beta DM currencies like the Swedish krona, NOK, or even euro.
Yeah. Sophie, that's a good place to leave it. Thank you so much for joining us so early on the day post ECB as well. That was Sophie Huynh, a senior cross-asset strategist at BNP Paribas Asset Management. Now for a look at some other stories we're following this morning. Boeing's Starliner capsule has docked with the International Space Station with 2 NASA astronauts on board. It's the first time astronauts have arrived at the space station via Boeing spacecraft. Starliner has suffered numerous delays, which pushed this test run back by 7 years. The astronauts are expected to stay at the station for about a week to practice procedures that will be helpful for future missions. And SpaceX's Starship rocket blasted into space before plunging back into Earth's atmosphere for an ocean landing, notching a key objective on its 4th major test flight. The vehicle landed in the Indian Ocean mostly intact. Elon Musk plans to use Starship to launch larger Starlink satellites and eventually bring cargo and people into space. Still ahead, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is expected to address a joint meeting of U.S. Congress as he faces intense criticism over the war against Hamas. This is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Bersachi in Dubai. Israel is escalating warnings against Hezbollah in Lebanon, saying it could be forced into a war following increasingly deadly attacks. Recent strikes from the Iran-backed group have caused significant damage as fighting intensifies on the Israel-Lebanon border. Let's bring in Dana Khresh, our bureau chief here in Dubai. I saw some comments from Prime Minister Netanyahu yesterday saying one way or another we will restore security to the north, and things really seem to be escalating on that border. What do we know? What is the latest?
So Netanyahu's comments came when he visited Kiryat Shmona, which is in North Israel, and that's where an unusual blaze happened a couple of days ago because of Hezbollah rockets. So we've seen Hezbollah really ramping up those attacks, right? Drones, rockets, the Katyusha rockets that caused the fire and have caused a lot of also casualties on Israeli side. We've seen Hezbollah militants go really close to the border, and that close proximity is giving them an advantage, right? So these are going undetected by Israeli defense systems. And that is causing alarm among officials in Israel and the Lebanese officials as well. And the rhetoric that we've seen from Israel is also kind of concerning for Lebanese officials. We have from our own original reporting that the Prime Minister is making calls to international Arab partners to try to prevent an all-out war. But they say we don't trust any guarantees from Netanyahu or anyone else, but the one who has to make those calls is the U.S.
Yeah, well, I was going to ask you about the diplomatic efforts here, because Matt Miller was saying that they are hoping that there will be some form of a diplomatic resolution and no further intensification. Have we exhausted the diplomatic channels at this point?
I wouldn't say that yet. I think the U.S. has been trying since the war in Gaza to try to come to a resolution between Israel and Lebanon, particularly Hezbollah, and that hasn't worked out, but they were successful in preventing an all-out conflict. So the trading of fire across the border is still happening. And so Israel wants ultimately Hezbollah to move about 10 kilometers away from the border, and we know Hezbollah saying that publicly, that we won't go into any indirect negotiations on any terms without a ceasefire in Gaza. And actually, local media reports have said Hezbollah would reject any removal of their forces from that area. But in 2006, Hezbollah, during the war and the end of the war, was forced to make some kind of a compromise. So you never know when the escalation happens and when the pressure is on, things might change.
Yeah, and also keeping a close eye on exactly what happens with those ceasefire talks between Israel and Hamas. Again, don't seem to be going in the right direction here. But to that effect, I saw that we do actually have a date now for when Israeli Prime Minister is going to address U.S. Congress. That's going to happen on July 24th. There was some expectation it was going to happen in June. Obviously, it's been pushed back a month. What can we expect from that speech?
I mean, it is significant that he's making the speech to Congress, and I think he will just relay whatever he's been saying for so long, that what they want is three things: the destruction of Hamas and bringing back security to North Lebanon, to North Israel, and ultimately not to have Gaza be a security existential threat to Israel. And he's going to reiterate that this is for local audience and, of course, for his international partners.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately the pressure is on because there are many in the Israeli public who want to see the release of the hostages, and that's why you're seeing also demonstrations in Tel Aviv, so the pressure is on him. Dana, thank you so much for bringing us the latest on the region and in Lebanon. We're keeping a close eye on what happens there. That was Dana Khresh, our bureau chief in Dubai. Now, for a look at some of the other stories we're following, Aramco's mega stock offering is set to raise at least $11.2 billion, making it the biggest such deal globally in 3 years. Bloomberg understands the Saudi government is expected to sell almost 1.55 billion shares, or $7.27 apiece. The kingdom is selling stock in the oil giant to raise funds for its multi-trillion-dollar plan to diversify away from oil. Coming up, European parliamentary elections are underway, but what is at stake for the world's biggest multi-country vote? We are live in Brussels. Next, this is Bloomberg. Welcome back to Horizons Middle East and Africa. I'm Joanna Versace in Dubai. Well, voting is underway in the European Parliament elections, which will set EU policy direction for the next 5 years. After the Netherlands yesterday, Ireland and the Czech Republic are set to cast their ballots today. Let's go live to Brussels and speak to Bloomberg's Stephen Carroll. Stephen, wonderful to have you on our show. Thank you for getting up early for us. It feels as though the expectation is once more that these parties of the right in European nations are set to make some major gains in these elections. What are we expecting?
Well, there are two ways of looking at these elections. One is that it is, as you say, the biggest multi-country vote, some 370 million people casting their ballots for the 720 members of the European Parliament. That's going to broadly design the policy framework, the framework for how the EU is going to make laws over the next 5 years. They'll have to vote on the next president of the European Commission. Ursula von der Leyen wants a second term in that job, leading the EU executive, so she'll have to build a governing coalition, and that's where the performance of those far-right parties could be very crucial to watch, as Ursula von der Leyen may have to reach beyond her current allies in the Socialists and Democrats and the centrist Renews, as well as her own EPP party, to try and build a coalition to have support for herself. But it also could mean that when it comes to passing some of those landmark pieces of legislation through the European Parliament, that they'll have to try and build coalitions outside of traditional political groupings. The other way of looking at these elections is it's a vote in 27 different countries, and what we're getting is a temperature check of the politics in each of those member states as well. We often talk about these elections as being second-order elections. People tend to vote a little bit more to the extremes, a little bit more as a protest vote than they would in national elections as well. But it does give us an idea, perhaps, of how the players in the European political scene are performing. Take the example of France, where the whole campaign has been built around a referendum on Emmanuel Macron's leadership. The Rassemblement National, the far-right party there, expected to perform very well in opinion polls too. That's just one of the national political stories that is being referenced, and it's an interesting one to watch when we're thinking about the future direction at a national level as well as at an EU level.
Yeah, that's going to be a very close one to watch, especially because it has bearings on the next presidential elections, and Marine Le Pen isn't going anywhere. What would you say at an EU level, though, are the key policy challenges facing the next leaders?
I mean, obviously, we're more than 2 years now after Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and security issues still very much at the fore, and that's expected to be a major priority for the next leaders of the European Union as well. How can the EU galvanise its defence industry, because that's the area over which the EU can make those decisions, to try to, as leaders have previously declared they wanted to, increase investment, increase things like joint procurement, build up the capacity that Europe has to be able to tackle defence issues. The Green Deal, 5 years ago, it was climate issues that dominated these elections. We were in the midst of the climate protests led by Greta Thunberg, and those were something that really led to the passing of this most ambitious climate plan from the European Union. Now it's a question of the protests against some of those policies and what sort of impact they'll have as well. A third issue to watch, always one when it comes to Europe, competitiveness. How can the European economy keep up with the US and China?
Of course. Bloomberg's Stephen Carroll in Brussels, thank you so much. But that is it for a shortened version of Horizons Middle East and Africa. Up next is Africa Amplified, our monthly show looking at major events in the continent.